Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this session. We are going to be talking about retrocommissioning and monitor-based commissioning. So if that's not what you're here for, it's nice to see you anyway. This is going to be an AIA CEU course. And these are just required slides. You've already read the course description, so I'm not going to go through it. Our learning objectives. You're going to gain insight into the planning, piloting, and goal setting of a government-based MBCx program. I don't think we've been introduced, have we? Sorry for that. I'm Susan Freed. I'm project manager with the Energy and Sustainability Division at the County of San Diego.
Good afternoon, I'm Cliff Alberts. I work for a company called AESC based out of Carlsbad, California, and county is our client.
We're going to tag team this, so we're going to do a lot of upping and downing. So sorry if it's noisy. You're going to gain insight into the MBCx team structure and critical vendors that we use. We will clarify monitoring tools that we use and the role of analytics, and you will gain insight into the frequency and types of discrepancies that can come from commissioning. So before I jump into the agenda, I just want to make sure everyone had a great lunch, right? And no one is going to lapse into a postprandial stupor while we're talking, right? We'll try not to be too boring. I know halfway through we're going to have a joke, so just to make sure you're... raise your hand if you know what today is. There we go. May the 4th be with you. We don't have any Star Wars slides, I'm sorry to say, but the Force is with us. Force, whatever. Okay, so our agenda. We will be talking about the County of San Diego energy goals as a backdrop to how our program is running. We will summarize retrocommissioning and monitor-based commissioning as we practice it. Then go into some details about our programs, provide you with experiences from the field, and then looking towards the future. So some background. County of San Diego is a large county, over 4,200 square miles. It's the 9th largest county in California and the 2nd largest by population. So it's a big place. It takes hours to get from one corner to the next. Operations, we have over 1,300 buildings, which represents over 12 million square feet. And some of those, we have 2 campuses that are 1 million square feet each, and we have buildings that are 500 square feet. So it's quite a mix, different occupancy types as well. Last year, our utilities, we used over 96 million kilowatt hours annually, and interestingly, 17% of that came from on-site renewables. We used over 1.8 million therms for a price of $26.5 million. Our EUI, energy use intensity, last year was 47.7. If you have nothing to compare that to, I can tell you that when we first started counting our EUI back in 2010, we have reduced it by 60% in those 13 years. So that's pretty considerable. The way that we've managed to do this is because we have plans. And the reason we have plans is because we have a lot of stuff and we need to know how to deal with it. So back at the beginning of last decade, just seems like yesterday, doesn't it? California had a goal for all existing commercial facilities to reduce their energy use by 50% by 2030. So we were wondering, how are we going to do that? So we wrote ourselves a plan. We called it the Zero Energy Portfolio Plan. It was adopted in 2017. And it provided us with measures and metrics for how to reduce our energy use by 50% by 2030. Last year, we started the process a few years ago, but last year, the Board of Supervisors adopted this plan that we wrote, which we call the Zero Carbon Portfolio Plan. You can see that we've migrated from energy to carbon. And the reason is because we are unapologetically committed to reducing our carbon emissions anywhere we can find them. So this plan, it's for buildings, so it doesn't include electric vehicle charging or transitioning of the fleet, which we are also doing. But for buildings, we have a plan that has metrics and goals, actual metrics and goals to help us figure out how we're going to do 90% reduction by 2030. It's ambitious, but we're committed. So the measures, I'm just going to go through these real quickly. The measures from our original Zero Portfolio Plan were to install renewable energy on our sites, to build all new zero net energy buildings, to buy green electrons for small accounts that we couldn't mess around with. And for those that we could mess around with, we have a whole bunch of energy efficiency projects. With this plan, we were able to get $2 million a year from the general fund to implement those projects. And of course, we have proactive energy management, which helps us track, monitor, and analyze the work that we're doing from this plan. The plan that is replacing it, Zero Carbon, has some of the same measures. We brought back our EE projects. And I should say that a lot of the work that we've done through energy efficiency is simple, quick payback kinds of things, lighting, LED replacements. But a big chunk of that is retro-commissioning, and Cliff will talk about that at some point when I stop. Zero net energy, we're committed to that. Everything we build and into the future will be zero net energy. And all electric. Our renewable energy projects have slowed down a little because we've captured most of the opportunities and because the grid is getting greener, which brings me to the top measure, our green energy supply. By 2035, the entire county of San Diego will have a green grid. It will be 100% renewable. And that makes a huge difference in our emissions. But the second most impactful measure, which I'm not going to talk about, but I just want you all to know, is building electrification. We are actively seeking out all of the equipment that uses natural gas and determining how we're going to replace it. It's quite challenging. If any of you are trying to do that, you will know. So I'm going to hand it over to Cliff, but he is going to now talk about let's summarize for you our retro-commissioning program and our monitor-based commissioning program, the way we practice it.
Thank you, Susan. The retro-commissioning program was given birth to by the aggressive energy savings goals of the county. And essentially, some of the project funding started going to some of the energy projects, the retro-commissioning projects in about 2017. So by the end of 2018, we had finished a few of our initial retro-commissioning projects. Each one of the projects initially was assisted with funding through San Diego Gas and Electric's incentive programs. And so in that light, all of them were very energy focused. But I do want to acknowledge that as I've practiced retro-commissioning over the years, I do run into a lot of practitioners who will use the term retro-commissioning in different ways. And retro-commissioning can be simply a change out of a control system or some type of a project where you're fixing the existing controls that are on site. So I wanted to make sure that it was very clear that the type of projects that we're getting into are energy focused, and energy is the primary goal of the projects, not necessarily replacing the hardware or fixing the hardware. And that is, in my opinion, one of the defining reasons that we've had the type of energy saving success that we've had. In doing that, we follow a particular type of a process, and it's a bit different from a typical construction project or from the alternative retrocommissioning projects. And it actually goes into two different main phases. And the first phase is the initiating of an investigation, which is a very in-depth engineering look at the building. In which case, at the beginning of the investigation phase, what's really important to recognize is we really don't know what the outcome is going to be. We don't know what the implementation is going to be, which is sometimes difficult to contract, I suppose, and can be a little bit unnerving because you're not exactly sure what your goal is at the onset. The goal really is to save energy, but how do you identify what that path is going to be? A lot of other projects, construction projects or controls renovations, there are a lot more knowns at the beginning of the project than there are unknowns. So this investigation phase is a really critical component to occur prior to the implementation, and essentially all of the results from the investigation phase are what winds up fueling the conversations about what should be done during the implementation phase. A lot of those results are informed by opportunities that are found on site, and we take a look at every opportunity and we try to estimate how much energy savings are going to occur per opportunity, not a bundled approach. We're going to couple that with all of the different types of costs that may be involved with the implementation of that, and we bundle it together with something that looks kind of like an energy audit, but it's very, very focused for retrocommissioning. So in which case, many of those opportunities are deselected or they're modified over time, so it becomes a sort of a mixed process that changes and requires customization for every single facility that you wind up working on. So it's very exciting, but sometimes a bit chaotic. But the measures are evaluated on their cost and on their impact. The next slide, we're just going to show you the monitoring-based commissioning process as well, which is probably the most easily summarized through this graph, which is a common graph. You may have seen it before. But the combination of the two are important because once the retrocommissioning projects are performed, sometimes they remain vulnerable to drift or human error or something that's happened at the site that is going to disable whatever you just enabled. And in some cases, because the retrocommissioning projects are not necessarily hardware intensive, they might be controls intensive. This could be sequences of operations and settings and set points. They kind of remain vulnerable to being changed either accidentally or deliberately if there was some sort of a test that was occurring and then not being shifted out of manual mode, for instance. The graph here is going to show essentially the different phases of monitoring-based commissioning, or the amount of commitment that you could apply, and then the potential savings that are involved. So what we have is on the y-axis is the energy use of a facility. The x-axis is time. So if you look at the top line, you can see that's the business as usual. What tends to happen in facilities is they start to consume slight amounts of energy slowly over time, just through energy drift, we'll call it. The yellow section refers to savings that occur whenever a retrocommissioning project occurs. So you can see two steep lines in the yellow section that wind up going down sharply. Those would be moments in time when the building had a retrocommissioning. But if it's retrocommissioning alone, you also see the lines start to drift up again, just as if the building had not been touched at all. The green section essentially is what happens when, if you include monitoring-based commissioning, what you're attempting to do is to do the retrocommissioning, to accrue all of the savings, and then if the building is watched over time and monitored, to essentially just to maintain the savings that you had already achieved originally. And if it is planned out relatively well and you have a program that's funded to do that, we've proven, I believe, that that's not a challenge to do, but it needs to be thought through, planned, and focused on. In addition to just maintaining savings, what you also have the opportunity, in the two purple lines, slightly color-coded differently, are two different opportunities for the monitoring-based commissioning program to continue to find new energy savings over time. So instead of thinking about the energy savings as an event that occurred or a project that occurred, these could be things that can be continually reviewed. And as you have folks looking at the data, the information, the monitoring systems, you might be able to find new opportunities. So this seems to be a very natural next step for the program. You already have the infrastructure in place in the program. So the intent is to continue to use that as a tool to continue to accrue more savings over time. The next slide is going to be back to Susan, and she's going to show you what these two, retro commissioning and monitoring-based commissioning, what our results have been by the combination of both of those together. Thank you.
So everyone is interested in savings, and kind of summarize them in this slide. And I just want to reemphasize the fact that the way we do this is we do a retro-commissioning project. We end up with a great deal of savings projected. So, you know, we do the M&V. We know that the work that we've done is working, but over time, those savings can drift. And Cliff will tell you some of the experiences he's had with that. But in order to keep that from happening, we realized we needed to have a monitoring-based commissioning program going hand in hand with retro-commissioning. So I just want to make sure everybody realizes that. So over the course of the past 5 years, really 4.5 years, we have saved over 15 million kilowatt hours from these projects, over 380,000 therms, which is represented by a GHG reduction of about 7,500 metric tons of CO2e. The costs that we have incurred for all these projects since 2018 is about 1.6 million. But the savings, and this is cumulative savings, so over the 5 years annually, we have managed to accumulate savings year over year, is almost double that initial cost. So we have an average payback of 1.8 years. I'm telling you the truth, this is really good stuff. So I'm just gonna give you some samples of the projects that we've done. Each of our projects tends to have several measures. And again, Cliff mentioned this, but it depends on, so we'll come up with a list of prospective measures, and our facilities folks and the building occupants will say, we want to do these, but we don't want to do these, or however it ends up being. And so then we implement the measures that are universally accepted. So these graphs that you're going to look at here shows electricity before, the dark brown, electricity after, gas before and gas after, dark green before, light green after. This is at our Edgemoor Skilled Nursing Facility. This project saved about 21% of whole building electricity use. So the measures that we implemented, there was ventilation reduction, we had demand control ventilation, we had a few other things. So we weren't attacking the whole building, we were just attacking some subsystems that showed a lot of promise for opportunities to reduce. But those measures ended up saving over 20% of the whole building energy use. And that includes everything, all the equipment and all the lighting and all the televisions and plugging phones in or whatever. The gas savings were 10%. So the cost was under $500,000, paid back in 2.1 years. This project was at our San Diego Central Jail. I don't know how many of you work on jails, but you probably know, those of you who do, that it's pretty challenging to make changes in a detention facility. But there were a lot of opportunities here. And I also want to say that pretty much everywhere we have gone, in the 9 projects we've done in the past 5 years, there are savings. It's pretty shocking. Even new facilities have savings opportunities. So retro-commissioning is a very powerful tool. At this facility, we did some of the same things, demand control ventilation. We did exhaust fan reduction. And we saved, again, 20% of the whole building electricity use. This is 24/7 building, so the electricity use is pretty high. We didn't do a lot of gas measures, but we did save 1% of the whole building gas usage. at a cost of less than $500,000, 2.8-year payback. Our juvenile detention facility, we only did one measure, right? And it was return air fan modulation. Put in some VFDs, but this project saved 44% of the whole building and electricity usage. We didn't do any gas measures, but just that alone should be a testament to how wonderful this practice is. It cost us a little under $0.3 million, and it paid back in 1.4 years. That's summary from my point of view. I'm an owner, I'm not an engineer. So let's have our engineer tell us how these things got done.
Thank you again, Susan. Susan just went over the whole building savings. I'm just going to go over some examples of actual projects and some of the measures that had occurred, and kind of provide a little bit of details. So I'll linger on each slide a little bit and talk about the type of equipment that was used to monitor it, and you can see we've done some analysis. It was also suggested, since this is the session that's directly after lunch, that halfway through we tell a joke to wake everybody up, so if you're sleeping. So, and I'm an engineer, so I guess I'm supposed to tell an engineering joke. It's a little bit dangerous, engineers telling jokes. So a psychologist asks for 3 other patients to come into their office and proceeds to sit all 3 of the patients down at a table. The psychologist then puts a clear glass on the table, pulls out a pitcher of water and fills up the glass, about halfway. Asks the first patient, "Tell me what you see." The patient says, "The glass is half empty." Of course, they're a pessimist. The second patient says, "The glass is half full." So obviously they're an optimist. The third patient is an engineer and says, "Your glass is twice as large as it needs to be." I'm not supposed to be funny, I'm just an engineer, so it's not my scope of work to actually write jokes, so not everybody's awake, hopefully. Okay, so the first project we're looking at here is a library. It's about a 10,000 square foot library. It has one rooftop unit. The rooftop unit essentially provides the conditioning and the ventilation for the entire facility, so there's only one. What you're looking at is the power monitoring that has been applied to the power distribution center and the circuits that supply that rooftop unit, so it includes the fans and the compressors and any of the electronics. What you're looking at essentially is scatter plots of 2 different time periods. The blue dots are essentially the power, and the power is on the y-axis, by the way. Outside air temperature is on the x-axis. So what you're seeing is the blue dots are before, and the gray dots are after retrocommissioning. This was a relatively simple measure, but it was the most appropriate measure in terms of how much it would cost to implement in the savings. And you can see very clearly from the data that essentially as the outside air temperature drops, the amount of power that the unit uses after the retrocommissioning, which are the gray dots, is significantly less. Because there are more and more hours of that time period, that means that all of those savings continue to accrue more and more. So we think of things, tend to think of things in air conditioning on the hottest days, which is true, you need that capacity, but from an energy saving standpoint, you don't have quite as many hours to multiply savings from those times of the day. So this is a very powerful measure. The energy savings for this, the entire building energy was reduced by 17% through this one energy savings measure. Oh, and this is considered what we call a light touch, so there's no hardware changes, it's just a little bit of programming. The second measure, which is a little bit more hardware, we'll call this a medium touch. We installed a few pieces of hardware, and essentially this is multiple measures at a office building. The office building is also serving not customers, county.
Family Resource Center.
Yes, the Family Resource Center. So there's a walk-up counter that people who are the public, it serves the public, and essentially people can have a walk-up counter, and so it's part office and a little bit of a walk-up counter, essentially. The problems that the facility had is that they had three air handling units and a separate chilled water system, even though it was a relatively smaller system. Smaller building by square footage. It's about 20,000 square foot, but it had its own chilled water plant. The chilled water lockout was connected with air handler 3, but that was facing west. The other two air handlers were facing north and east, and what would happen is the economizer mode would shut off on air handler 1 initially in the early hours of the morning because the sun was shining on it, and it thought it was warming up. Well, the one that was controlling the chilled water plant was facing west and was getting absolutely no sun. So what you'd have is a scenario where you had no economizer mode and the chiller was still off, and people were warming up and they didn't know how and why. And you had all these manual overrides coming in to try to make sure you just had enough cooling because they were always getting cooling complaints. So the solution to that was to essentially to simplify how the program was looking at the outside air temperature sensors. Instead of linking it to one of the air handlers, we just had and installed a simple outside air temperature sensor, and then the other three were just mothballed in place. In addition to that, to capture the energy savings, we wanted to make sure that we're watching that happen. We installed a power monitor, and the power monitor was installed on the chiller itself, and then that data is being brought back into the supervisory control system and is data logged. So it wasn't really a lot of hardware that went into this, but it was a lot of in-depth analysis first to figure out what was happening. The goal was to save energy, but at the same time, I believe we helped them fix a chronic issue of not being able to cool things, to cool down parts of the building at certain times of the day. We added some extra measures to the project, which include not just synchronizing the OA lockouts, but also revising the schedules. We implemented a chilled water supply temperature reset, which is the water temperature that was being sent into the building. We also adjusted the chilled water, the secondary chilled water system, which was initially set at about 17 PSI, which was more than what was needed. The energy savings for this building in total was 28% kilowatt hours from electricity and 42% of the total therms of the building. The payback was about 1.5 years. The last measure I'll talk about is what we'd consider a bit more of a heavy touch. And this is one particular measure at a project. Susan already mentioned before, anyone who attends CxEnergy next year in San Diego, if you're driving down Front Street, you can see this building. It's about an 11-story building, and it's the one with all the cop cars driving into it or the buses with inmates. So right in the downtown area of San Diego, it's a tower. We had a number of measures during the project, but this one in particular I found very interesting because of the results. And this particular measure was demand control ventilation for what's called the Sally port. And anybody who is not familiar with the Sally port, that is, in short, the place where they drive police vehicles, whether it's a bus or a cop car, and they're bringing people who are from right off the street or might be brought over from another jail or from some other location, and this is where they enter, essentially. And it is like a parking garage, so it is intended to be ventilated like a parking garage. The diversity of how often it has cars or buses inside of it is high. So sometimes you might have a number of cop cars bringing people in from an incident, and they're all idling. So if you can imagine a lot of cars or buses that are idling, but then once that's over, it's just like a parking lot where none of the cars are on. So that differential with how often you actually have exhaust and how often you need to have the exhaust fans running is actually evident in the results that we're showing here. Before I get to the results, essentially this required design to license PE was part of the project. There are specialized controls to do this. There weren't just standard controls, they're dedicated specialized controls. We deployed 8 different carbon monoxide sensors around the Sally port, and then 1 VFD. So the exhaust fan that was used to exhaust this was just running full speed all the time. If you look at the data plot, you see power once again on the y-axis. This is over roughly about a 1-month period. You can see the transition from when power that was being monitored is very clearly showing consistently operating 24 hours a day. The exhaust fan, which was not quite 11 kW kilowatts, but close to it or maybe just on it. And then once the system was installed, you can see that the power dropped significantly. It now uses, I think it's like 350 watts or 0.35 watts, which is less than a hair dryer. It's less than a toaster oven. You know, it's just an amazing drop. When it's needed, the system will then automatically start to ventilate more, and you can see those as evident in the spikes in the power consumption. So the moments that it needs to be running at full speed, it does, and the moments it doesn't, it backs off and runs at a very low speed. So what we're doing is supply and demand between the requirements for ventilation and what's actually being supplied. Energy savings we have in here at 90%. I think it's well over 90%, and it's obvious from the graph, but let's just say it's about 90%. That is at the subsystem level, that's not the whole building. So some of the tools that we use to continually monitor, some of those we're actively trying to deploy them during the retro commissioning project to enhance our visibility into the operation before the measure is performed, as well as to use as a calculation tool so that we could look at before and after, like we did the chiller, the one project. All of those are all of those are strategically also deployed and intended to be connected into something called the BAS. And BAS is a common term, Building Automation System. The county actually uses that as their formal term. They call it the BAS, and it is their Niagara-based supervisory control system. So that in of itself is a really interesting feature that you don't see at every campus or every customer that you'd go to. But essentially what the supervisory BAS system is a Niagara-based control system which then communicates to all of the individual local buildings. So you might have Siemens installed here, Trane here, Ellerton, JCI, ALC, if I forgot any, just et cetera, whatever the local control systems are. And then the BAS then is simply connected to and communicating with that local system, then pulling all the data from the local system into one portal. And then that can be viewed at any of the county facilities where that software is installed. So it makes it very easy to be in one location and to be able to view multiple sites. It's a significant asset. And so the idea being is noticing this and this tool that's really handy and is already collecting the data, we want to make sure that anything that we're deploying is going to start reporting into it so it can be used ongoing. So the point being is not just to be used for a project, but to be used ongoing so it's an asset that continues to provide value. All the data that's being pulled up into the BAS is then stored inside of a server. So you also have the IT department is involved because they are hosting the server for all of the county's operations. So this is kind of where IT and OT meet a little bit. You have all this operational data, and it is being stored on the IT network. Some of the other devices that we use, which are handheld devices, also include data loggers, thermal imaging camera, which was really handy when we went through I think it's the only steam plant in the whole county is at the East Mesa facility, and handheld power meters at certain times. I do want to be clear, though, that analytics software has not been deployed yet. We are looking at analytics software, but all this is being done without analytics, which the more I thought about that, it's kind of a defining thing that I want to make sure is clear. And it's not that we're against it. I'm actually for analytics, but there's no budget for it yet. So the question is, at what point does the manual methodology that we have of looking at the data become too much as the program grows and the number of facilities grows? And at what point do you really need that for the efficiency gains, that I can afford? So now that we have all these high performance projects that have been funded and installed and working through the descriptions of those projects, perhaps it's intuitive to see that anything that was achieved through programming that also has vulnerability based off of sequences of operations or schedules or set points can continue to be vulnerable over time to be changed. And most of the time it's accidental. And so these is a list of the discrepancies that we found that can relatively quickly start occurring at any of the sites. So the point being is we have all this great savings. We're really enjoying that. It fits financially really well. But if we start to notice these discrepancies are happening, we want to make sure that there's a program in place that will continue to watch the facilities so that as the discrepancies occur, this is going to resolve the discrepancies and then it just won't linger. And then you get the drift and everything that we don't want to see happen. So I'll just walk through some of the discrepancies that we've seen and kind of give you some of the observations. So manual overrides are probably number one. If you've ever been in operations, that probably would have been the first one that you'd pick on as is a main issue. Manual overrides happen all the time for very good reasons. If you're testing equipment, something happens and you want to ensure that this one particular zone is going to be taken care of. So it's not a negative towards manual overrides. The only problem is they usually stay in manual mode, or sometimes they're at risk for staying in manual mode. So if nobody's watching and no one's caring, that can continue literally for years. Deferred maintenance, if you have a sequence of operations that is programmed and intended to be using the operation of other pieces of equipment to determine how the sequence works, then when those other pieces of equipment, and in particular, there's usually a lot of VAVs that are part of a sequence or can be part of a sequence. If for whatever reason you have 100 VAVs that are being looked at as part of a sequence and then one of them stops doing what it's supposed to do and no one's noticed yet, then it will disable whatever you have enabled, and the whole energy sequence then will not be working. On occasions, there'll be new projects, not necessarily TIs or major renovations, but there'll be some other project that occurs at a facility and it inadvertently is changing the programs and accidentally turns off something that was working before. Because the county's particular control systems are set up control topology-wise as a supervisory control system with lots of individual local control systems, some of the supervisory BAS system is not just monitoring, it is actually also then sending is being used for things like scheduling, so you can schedule a major holiday and every single facility is then just getting the same schedule on a major holiday, for instance. But because of that, you're relying on the signal interchange between the upper level supervisory control and the lower level. And if that signal exchange does not work, and it sounds kind of simple, but if it doesn't work, then the systems will not turn off and they'll think that they're continually supposed to be running. So the point of that being is you can actually show and sometimes see that there's a program that's been programmed and intended to be occurring schedule-wise that just actually isn't happening when you look at the actual data. And if you have power meters on equipment, that occurs pretty quickly, because if it's supposed to be off but it's drawing power, then that's pretty direct feedback. On occasion, there's discretionary adjustments by building engineers, and on occasion, you'll see the use of proxy variable feedback. I like to use power data for the feedback. It's the most definitive way of proving of not just that something's operating, but a sense of what its load is or how it's operating or what might be happening at a certain time. If you're using proxy variable feedback, sometimes that can throw you off. So if someone thinks that there's a commanded speed that's occurring and it's commanded off, that's not proof really that it's been turned off. That just means that you are hoping that the systems are working and they're all being turned off. So the point being is to focus on, when doing this from a strategic standpoint, enabling as many direct points of feedback that you can get to confirm what the operation is. Okay, so now that we have all the measures and the buildings starting to be brought on and some of this occurring, and we're noticing these discrepancies, the county does not have a formal process on how to start to review all of the facilities and to review all of the subsystems. There's no definitive who's going to be doing this, or who's going to pay for this, or how is that going to work? Who's going to be involved? How are they going to play in the sandbox together? So what we decided to do, and what I had suggested, is for the county to consider a monitoring-based commissioning program. And the intent of the monitoring-based commissioning program is to do what we initially stated, was essentially to preserve the retro-commissioning savings that had occurred before. A few other goals, which are very natural extensions of that, is to continue to find the new savings opportunities, and then also to make monitoring a standard practice. Those were relatively easy to come up with, I think, as far as the goals, but the framework on how to make that happen inside of a government agency with lots of different stakeholders and divisions and siloing of personnel and missions made that actually much more challenging to put into place. But we felt very, very strongly that a plan needed to be put in place, and a framework, which is not written in stone, it's something that can be flexible, but a framework to try to say, well, how are we going to achieve this? So a good example of how to frame this is there's lots of software companies that you can see. And I encourage you to look at all the folks who are showing during the show at the expo. All of those tools are showing data, and they'll be pulling up anomalies and discrepancies and showing you information about energy or the way that subsystems work. But what's important to recognize is, okay, now that you have all this data, who's actually going to be looking at it? And under whose budget is that going to be occurring? And once they see that, who are they going to talk to try to resolve it? And are those people actually going to be able to resolve it? Do they have the right skill sets? So after having enough of these conversations internally and sort of really thinking deeply about it, what we came to is that there's three main components that you need to have as part of your plan. And those three are personnel, processes, we're going to call it resources. So essentially the personnel, initially we had intended and thought, as occurs in a lot of control system deployments, is that you're going to kind of show the alerts or show the alarms to the building engineer, and then they're just going to get resolved, which is a little bit of a throw it over the wall sort of style. Over time, we figured out that that was not going to work for a number of reasons, but essentially because they don't have the time, and in many cases, this is not a skill set that they have. They're not commissioning agents, they're not controls experts, they're building engineers, and they're working on a lot of different things. So we put together what we thought would be a monitoring-based commissioning team, which includes field staff, it includes vendors, it includes administrators, includes consultants, engineers like myself for at least a period of time. And in that, we included also processes, and the processes always start with a thorough analysis and essentially a hierarchical review of data. So to keep the time to minimum, we want to not look at all data points, we want to prioritize data points. And that's very different from, I think, a typical technician's way of thinking of things. And then we have resources. Some of those resources are already the monitoring resources we've also talked about, but some of those resources are also contracts, to be able to contract out to critical vendors who are part of your MBCx team or that you're considering part of the team that you need in order to resolve discrepancies. Because now we have so many different people who are involved, and because this is a program that needs to be justified, reporting and communication are very, very critical. So what we did is we decided to do this as a pilot first, and the pilot was intended as, let's have some lessons learned. Let's not spend too much money initially. Let's keep this within a manageable amount of tasks. And essentially what we did is the first 5 projects, we included in what we call the monitoring-based commissioning pilot. Monitoring-based commissioning pilot had a number of takeaways that were tremendously revealing. Within the first 6 months, we found that most of the facilities had major discrepancies that had occurred of the categories that we've already mentioned. Most of those had to do with set points or schedules or sequences of operations, and what it confirmed with us was the vulnerability of the same things that we had achieved the savings. The positive side of that is that the resolutions were relatively quick, and it just really just needed to have somebody who was actually watching and on scope, and then having a structure of, once those are identified, how we're going to resolve those. Each one of these in this case begins with an offsite analysis, and I want to emphasize that that's really important, the offsite analysis part. It's a knee-jerk reaction to usually want to send a technician to site and say, hey, please go fix that. But in this case, what we're doing is we're trying to do much more analysis offsite first, so we know whoever we're sending to the site is going to be the person with the right skill sets, or whether or not the folks who are on site might be able to do this themselves. So rather than taking the easier, let's just contract somebody to go to site to do it, we're trying to figure that out offsite most of the time. That winds up resulting in usually a resolution that it doesn't take days, it's usually hours, it's usually under 4 hours. So in other words, all of the savings can continue to be preserved with relatively quick resolutions as long as this is all planned out, and it starts with some pretty good analysis and the tools that will be able to feed you all this information to do the analysis. So some of the critical needs in this process is that your team has to have a varying skill set. So we include, as part of our team, controls vendors who are specialists in whatever their brand is. There are people who are part of the county who are also specialists who operate the BAS system and are specialists in the interaction between the supervisory BAS and the lower control systems. We have administrators, we have program managers, and really it's just a wide variety of skills. The process framework is really important, the goals are important, and once again, all the tools to support all of this is really, really important. And lastly, and it's a subtlety, is to make sure that you have the contracting mechanisms. So when you do need a vendor, and as is in government contracting, many of their existing contracts may be limited with the type of services they can perform. So you need to have something, a secondary contract that's going to be flexible enough so you could be able to bring people to site. And it's not as easy as a private business, because in government contracting, there's a lot more limitations with what you can do because it's public funding. So anyway, that's it for that. And Susan is going to come up next and talk about the communication flow within the program that we've set up.
I have this lovely flow chart to describe how we do these things. Our MBCx program has a core team. The core team consists of a program manager, that's me, Energy and Sustainability Division. We have staff that are involved in monitoring our building automation system. We have field staff from facility operations, and we have our program engineer. The core team gets together twice a month, and when things are really hot and heavy, things are changing, there's discrepancies, there's resolutions, and we discuss all these things, get approval from everybody, and then go forward with it. So the three tasks that this program has been designed to do, there's the basic task, and the basic task is to monitor the facilities, and that's done by our program engineer. He delivers information monthly to the core team. Here's what's going on. Most of the time, it's copacetic. Sometimes there are discrepancies that need to be fixed. So when there are discrepancies that need to be fixed, there's a supporting task, which is to correct those deficiencies. And the deficiencies, our program engineer will determine, here's what we need to do. And Cliff talked about this a little bit. We do a lot of planning ahead of time. Here's the thing that needs to be done. Here's who's going to do it. Here's when they're going to do it. Here's a supporting group of people who are going to help get it done. So every corrective action has a whole team of people that are working together to make it happen. And then we have our monitoring team, the VAS folks, and Cliff is monitoring it as well. Then we have a value-added task. And the value-added task is, how are we going to grow our program? We're growing it in two ways. We're adding more facilities, but we're also considering doing other things like analytics to make the work easier and less labor-intensive. Right now we have 9 facilities, and every year we add more because we keep doing retrocommissioning projects. So at some point we're going to have a lot more, and at that point we'll need analytics. But we're still kind of churning through, how are we going to do this? What kind of tools are we going to use, and how much is it going to cost? Who's going to pay for it? But right now, those are the 3 tasks. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, and I really think that if anyone is planning to do a monitoring-based commissioning program, you need to have a plan like this. You need to identify who is doing what and how they're doing it together. So I have to say that having all of this experimentation being successful, we have now determined that this plan works. It's proven to maintain significant savings. We've corrected backsliding. We've found new energy savings. And we are ready now to transition from the project, it was a project, to a program. And the program will be embedded in the department operation plan and in the department's budget. And that hasn't happened yet, but we're still working on it. But from this experience, we wrote this plan, our monitoring-based commissioning program plan. Anyone who wants it, let me know and I'll send it to you. It's pretty thorough, but it's part of our larger zero carbon portfolio plan, which I told you about before. And the zero carbon portfolio plan was approved by the Board of Supervisors last year, and we are getting money to do more of this work. So the proof is in the pudding, and if money is available, I mean, a lot of governments don't have money, but San Diego does. And so because we have been able to document it and codify it, we've been able to get more money to do to do more work. So we're growing. We've added 4 sites. We're going to continue to add sites every year. We have at least 2 retrocommissioning projects. It's a model. I have to say, it may not be perfect, but it's a good model for anyone who wants to take this on. So next steps. From a strategic point of view, as I mentioned, we need to integrate it into department processes. It needs to be something that's embraced by the whole department, the whole county, and celebrated. We are getting money. We need to show results to our investors, and that forces us to work together successfully. And in order to encourage further development, we need to broaden our reporting and publicize better the savings that we're doing. And we have some tactical changes that we're.
So lastly, the tactical next steps include, as I had mentioned before, the use of analytics tools as it continues to grow and more data needs to be processed. Do want to acknowledge that the nexus between IT and OT, operational information that's being processed and stored, warehoused in the IT group's servers. There are challenges there, especially with a government agency, because there's a tremendous amount of security involved with accessing the information. So they do not move quick. They move slow and deliberately, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that's a good thing, but that is a challenge because the goals for savings are a shorter timeline, not a longer one. Also, we're looking at new metrics to capture energy efficiency that we can talk to executive leadership about, or those in supervisory positions in ways that are a little less technical and more frame of reference, such as just basic efficiencies or ranges of fan speeds, and essentially terminology we're considering to develop that will make that conversation easier. And that's it. Any questions for me or Susan? We have a microphone coming over.
I have 2 questions. The first one is for Susan, then I have one for Cliff as well. So for the first question, Susan, what was the initial thought behind these projects? Was it for energy savings? Was it for reducing greenhouse gas emissions? A little bit of both?
Well, yeah, the county has been interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions for a long time, and we've had a strategic energy plan for over 15 years. The Zero Net Energy Portfolio Plan was the first time that we actually measured this particular metric. So originally, because it was a California goal, we had to reduce our energy use, and retrocommissioning is just a really powerful, quick, easy way to do that. That's how we got into that practice. And as we both mentioned several times, we followed up on that with the monitor-based commissioning program because we didn't want to lose. So MBCx sustains our CX savings. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And then my second question, in a logistical fashion for the light and medium touch strategies that you showcased, the controls contractor, how were you presenting the scope of work to them? Were you preparing contract documents? Were you writing a sequence of operations? And then were you the county just directly contracting the controls contractor? Was there a general contractor involved? I'm just trying to envision the logistics in this and how you executed the actual work once you did realize the solution through retrocommissioning. And then did you commission it afterwards after the work was done? So I guess a 2-part question.
Let me start by answering that by saying that the county has contracts with commissioning companies, and it explicitly describes retrocommissioning and monitor-based commissioning as activities that are allowed within our contracts.
Yeah, I suppose in one word, it's custom for every project. There's no standard. Having the contracts and the process in place that everyone is understanding and acknowledging is a custom process helps. In which case, I've done it. Initially, we were writing out lots of individual scopes of works very clearly. What I found with this type of project is that most of the time they were not understanding necessarily what we were requesting from the written scope of work. We wind up going to a verbal discussion most of the time anyway. So the scope of work will include enough verbiage to capture what they can sort of invoice us on necessarily, but what's actually being on site is a little bit more dynamic and usually is done not in a, we're going to hand you scope of work. It is more like we're going to go to site with you and then we're going to explain and we'll talk about it. And then in some cases, because, or I should say in a lot of cases, we're using the vendors that the county already has for the sites and they know their equipment better than us. So we don't necessarily want to give them a scope of work that would be different from what they would have selected themselves. So what I find best to do, and this is just a personal style, is to ask them what sort of sequence would you use if you wanted to achieve this goal, and then to socialize that to see whether or not there's any problems with that, or if there's a couple different options. And there are folks who work at the county who are very experienced technicians. They may already have preferences as well, so we don't want to walk in and offer something that would contradict what their preferences already are. So it's carefully walking through each process from the actual scope standpoint. It usually includes multiple different vendors and has historically used lots of different contracting mechanisms. And some of them are construction contracts, depending on whether or not there's the hardware component. If we're installing VFDs or control systems, then that usually is going to veer towards more of a construction process. But if not, then as needed contracts are very helpful and very flexible. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, I have one. Oh, do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Congratulations, by the way, as representatives of building operators. That's quite something. That's quite an achievement. I have a question for Cliff on slide 12. That seesaw graph that you presented, Richard Procease in 2018 at the World Energy Engineering Congress presented a very similar slide.
Yeah.
And he took it so far as to put an increment of time on the bottom for the yellow section where the big line goes up.
Yeah.
And it was just his suggestion. It wasn't doctrine. Yeah. But I want to know your opinion on how long it takes to get from the bottom of the yellow back up to the top of the yellow.
6 months.
That's a great question. Sometimes it's within a month.
Really?
Yeah, no, there's projects where we followed up a month later and there's already been an adjustment, accidental, deliberate, something's happened on site and nobody knew quite yet, and you can do all the training and the discussion with folks as much as you want. You know, they're gonna go for what they know in the time of trouble, and that will work in a short period. But I would actually say that it's not in my experience, a slow drift. It's usually more like a catastrophic change very quickly that then lingers for quite a while.
So how do you overcome that? I mean, you come back a month later and it's like, oh man, this is a train wreck. What are you guys doing? I mean, how do you?
That's the whole point of the monitoring-based commissioning program.
Cliff is a very nice person, and he gets together with the facility staff and talks about, you know, here's what we should be doing.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. It's a good question. Thank you.
Next question, how did you choose the first 9 of the 1,300 buildings within the pilot? And then kind of a similar question, with the approved budget, what is your kind of plan or projected number of buildings that you're going to execute per year?
That's a good question. The very first project we did was an incentive project. We looked at all of our largest facilities, our largest energy users, compared EUIs with what they should be, and the first project was like 300% higher than it should be. I knew there was some problem with ventilation there, so we applied to the incentive program. We got Cliff. We implemented that. The second one and the third one were both incentive program projects. So, you know, the incentive program is we do the work, we show that it's done, it's energy savings. Over the course of 3 years, they send us money. So, everybody likes to get money back. But I mentioned that we have funding every year. The Zero Net Energy Portfolio Plan gave us $2 million. Our carbon plan is giving us a lot more. $2.5 million next year, and it's going to keep going up for other things besides this. But with that money, I continue to look at our portfolio, and whatever's next is coming up. I look for the best opportunities.
One more question, I guess. You're off.
I saw your slide about monitoring monthly. I would like to know how you identified the ways you get the monitoring. Was it the points you identified, or did you put together trends that you needed, and how you did the process of getting the information for analysis from the monitored points?
How the data comes to us?
How did you define it, and how did you get that on a process for you to get this information regularly?
The information, most of it comes through the supervisory VAS system. And if anybody is familiar with Niagara framework, that enables you to have data histories. And the data histories are also empowered by the IT's group, their data logging historian. So we can pull trends and do graphical trends relatively easy with that system. And that's the tool. It's a manual process. It's not analytics. Yeah. No, this is old school. We're just going to look at what's happening. Yeah. Okay. I think that answered the question. Last question?
Thanks. I have two comments, I guess. One is, as a monitoring-based commissioning provider, I think it's amazing what you've done without an analytics package, because I've found that that's a very powerful tool.
Yep.
I also get the question quite often about analytics, what will it save? And I'm like, well, it won't save anything unless you do action. So you guys haven't done a pilot program to identify who on the team will take action on the results that you find.
Yeah.
That's excellent. I guess my question is more around, like you said, the reason for monitoring-based commissioning is to see the persistence of savings over time, and that it's maintained, because you need to maintain those investments that have been made.
That's right.
And so I'm just curious, do you foresee in the future, the question I get is if the value of that investment in monitoring-based commissioning is to avoid energy that you don't know, you can't really calculate a payback for it because you don't know what you didn't save, right? You just know that you maintained it, and that's the value, as opposed to with special commission, you started here and you dropped down like this.
We
graph is showing here. So I'm kind of curious, what you guys are thinking, justifying that budget that you're getting in terms of the persistence and how that's conversations going to go.
Because we focus on the energy, and the energy can be quantified dollars-wise, then we we practice IPMVP's methods to calculate energy savings. So we do calculate the energy savings. Those numbers are not projected, those are actuals over time.
I understand, but I guess I'm saying that when you're monitoring-based commissioning and you're flatline, 3 years from now, and you've still maintained it, are you just saying, hey, we're still paying for it based on what we did initially? Is that what you mean?
We're claiming savings not just for the first year, we claim for savings ongoing, Because if it's not there and it starts to drift, as we've already proven it does, then, and we proved that they continue to happen, I think we're out of time, but okay. Thank you.